The rain fell like bullets on the weathered roof of the old ranch house, each drop echoing through the empty rooms where Thomas McKinnon sat alone. For 7 years, he had grown accustomed to the sound of his own breathing, the creak of floorboards under his boots and the whistle of wind through the gaps in the barn walls. The Montana Territory stretched endlessly around his property, a sea of grass and sky that had become both his sanctuary and his prison. Thomas pressed his calloused fingers against his temples, trying to push away memories that came with every storm. 7 years since the war ended. 7 years since he'd returned home to find his life shattered like glass on stone. 7 years since Catherine. The thunder rolled across the plains, and Thomas rose from his chair by the window. At 32, his face bore lines that spoke of more than just sun and wind. His dark hair, once carefully combed for Sunday church, now hung loose around his shoulders. He'd stopped caring about such things when caring had stopped Matt. As he moved toward the kitchen to pour another cup of coffee, a sound made him freeze. It wasn't thunder or rain or the usual groaning of his old house. It was something. Elsa cry, perhaps, or a call for help carried on the wind. Thomas grabbed his rifle from above the mantel and opened the front door. The rain struck his face like ice, and he squinted into the darkness beyond his porch. Lightning illuminated the yard for a brief moment, and in that flash of white light, he saw her. A woman knelt in the mud near his gate, her dress plastered. To her trembling form, her long hair hanging like wet silk around her face. She wasn't moving, just kneeling there in the storm as if she'd given up on everything, including her own life. Thomas didn't think. He dropped the rifle and ran into the rain, his boots splashing through puddles and mud. As he drew closer, his heart nearly stopped beating entirely, even soaked and bedraggled. Even after 7 years, he would know that face anywhere, Catherine, he whispered. But the wind snatched his voice away. She looked up at him then, and her eyes, those same blue eyes that had haunted his dreams, were filled with a desperation he'd never seen before. Her lips, blue with cold, tried to form words.
"Thomas?"
she managed. And then she collapsed forward into his arms. The warmth of the house slowly brought Catherine back to consciousness. She found herself wrapped in thick blankets on the sofa. Near the fireplace, the flames casting dancing shadows on walls she remembered from another lifetime. For a moment she wondered if she was dreaming. The fever had finally taken her mind completely. But then Thomas appeared in the doorway, carrying a steaming cup, and she knew this was terrifyingly real. He looked older, weathered by years and sorrow in a way that made her heart ache. His eyes, once so full of laughter and hope, now held a guarded wariness that she knew she had put there. He'd grown a beard, and there were silver threads in his dark hair that hadn't been there when she'd last seen him. "Drink this," he said quietly, offering her the cup. His voice was rougher than she remembered, as if he'd spent years shouting into the wind or had simply forgotten how to speak gently. Catherine's hands shook as she accepted the warm coffee, inhaling its rich scent. "Thomas, I don't." The word came out sharper than he'd intended, and she flinched. He softened his tone, but his eyes remained distant. "Don't say anything yet. Just get warm." They sat in silence, broken only by the crackling fire and the continuing storm outside. Catherine studied his profile as he stared into the flames, noting the way his jaw tightened, the way his hands clenched and unclenched on his knees. She had so much to tell him, so much to explain, but the words felt too heavy for her tired heart. Finally, Thomas spoke. "Where's your husband?" The question hit her like a physical blow, and she nearly dropped the cup. Robert is dead, Thomas." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or pain. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said formally, as if she were a stranger. "Are you?" The words escaped before she could stop them, and she saw him stiffen. "I wouldn't wish death on any man, Catherine, not even him." The way he said her name, careful, distant, like he was handling something that might break, made tears spring to her eyes. "Thomas, please, let me explain what happened. Let me tell you why you married Robert Carmichael 3 weeks after I left for the war." His voice was quiet, but she heard the years of pain beneath it. Why you were carrying his child when I came home. Why you couldn't even look at me when I stood on your front porch, still wearing my uniform, still believing you'd waited for me. Catherine set down the cup with trembling hands. It wasn't what you think, wasn't it? Thomas finally looked at her, and the raw hurt in his eyes was almost unbearable. You promised you'd wait, Catherine. You wore my ring. You said you'd love me until the day you died. I did love you. The words burst out of her like a dam breaking. I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day. Thomas stood abruptly, turning his back to her. Then why? Catherine closed her eyes, summoning the strength to tell him the truth she'd carried like a stone in her chest for 7 years. Because your father came to see me. Thomas went very still. What, 2 months after you left? He came to our house when Papa was in town? Catherine's voice dropped to a whisper. He told me you were dead, Thomas. He said you'd been killed at Bull Run, that he'd received word from your commanding officer. Thomas turned around slowly, his face pale. That's impossible. My father knew I was alive. Wrote letters. He burned them. Catherine's voice broke. I found out later that he burned them all. He was so afraid I'd hold you back from the life he wanted for you, the marriage he'd arranged with that banker's daughter in Denver. He thought if I believed you were dead, I'd move on. And when you came home, you'd be free to marry her. Silence stretched between them like a chasm. Thomas sank back into his chair, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. Robert knew, Catherine continued, her voice barely audible. He knew I was grieving, that I thought I'd lost the only man I'd ever love. He was ... persistent, kind at first. He courted me when I was too broken to resist, and when I finally accepted his proposal. It was only because I thought you were never coming home. The child, Thomas said hoarsely. Catherine's hands moved instinctively to her stomach, and Thomas saw the gesture. Pain flickered across her features like a shadow. Emily, she whispered. I named her Emily. She had your eyes, Thomas. That same dark green. For 6 years, every time I looked at her, I saw you. Had the word came out strangled? Catherine nodded, tears streaming down her face. The fever took her last winter, and Robert blamed me. Said I'd never loved her properly because she reminded me of you. He was right about that. God help me, but not in the way he meant. I loved her so much it nearly killed me, because she was all I had left of the man I'd lost. Thomas covered his face with his hands. Catherine, ... Robert became cruel after Emily died. She continued, needing to tell him everything now that she'd started. Always suspected she wasn't his, and losing her broke something in him. He started drinking, started hitting me. Came home drunk and told me the truth about your father's visits, about the letters. He laughed about it, Thomas. He laughed about how easy it had been to steal his dead rival's woman. Thomas looked up at her then, and she saw murder in his eyes. Where is he now? I told you, he's dead. How? Catherine met his gaze steadily. He came at me with his belt 3 nights ago, drunk and raging about Emily, about you, about how I'd never been a proper wife to him. I grabbed the fireplace poker to defend myself, and he slipped on the rug, hit his head on the hearth. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Rain continued to beat against the windows like desperate fingers trying to get in. I didn't mean to kill him, Catherine whispered, but I wasn't sorry either. I took what little money we had and his horse, and I ran. I've been riding for 3 days, trying to get here, trying to find you. Why? Thomas's voice was raw. Why come here, Catherine? Why now? She looked at him with eyes full of 7 years' worth of love and regret and desperate hope. Because I never stopped loving you. Because I've been dying a little more each day. Since I lost you, and losing Emily was the final blow. Because I have nothing left in this world except the love I should have given you 7 years ago. Thomas stood and walked to the window, staring out at the storm. My father's been dead for 3 years, he said quietly. I know, I heard. I never married the banker's daughter. Never married anyone. Catherine's heart clenched. Waited, he said, his voice barely audible. Even after I saw you with him, even after I knew you'd chosen someone else, some part of me kept waiting. Pathetic, isn't it? It's not pathetic, Catherine whispered, rising from the sofa, despite her weakness. It's love. It's the same kind of love that brought me back to you through a storm with nothing but the clothes on my back and a heart full of regret. Thomas turned to face her, and she saw tears in his eyes for the first time since she'd known him. You know what it was like, Catherine? Coming home from hell, thinking about nothing but holding you again, only to find you married to another man, carrying his child? She was your child, Catherine said firmly. In every way that mattered, she was yours. I told her about you, Thomas. I told her about the brave soldier who would have loved her if he'd had the chance. Thomas's composure finally cracked, and he sank into a chair, his shoulders shaking. I mourned you both, he whispered. I mourned the woman I loved and the life we should have had together. For 7 years, I've been living like a ghost. Catherine crossed to him on unsteady legs and knelt beside his chair, taking his hands in hers. They were rougher than she remembered, scarred by years of hard work and loneliness. But they were still the hands she dreamed of holding again. Then let's stop being ghosts, she said softly. Let's stop letting your father's lies and Robert's cruelty keep us apart. We've lost 7 years, Thomas, but we don't have to lose the rest of our lives. Thomas looked down at her, and she saw the war being fought behind his eyes, love battling with hurt, hope struggling against years of carefully built walls. I don't know how to trust again, he admitted. I don't know how to believe that this is real, that you won't disappear again. I won't, Catherine said fiercely. I swear to you, Thomas McKinnon, I will never leave you again, not by choice. Not by force, not if the whole world tries to tear us apart. Thomas reached out slowly, as if she might vanish at his touch, and cupped her face in his hands. His thumbs brushed away her tears, and she leaned into his touch like a flower turning toward the sun. I never stopped loving you either, he whispered. God help me, I tried, but I never stopped. The storm passed during the night, leaving the world washed clean and gleaming under the morning sun. Catherine woke to find herself alone on the sofa, wrapped in blankets that smelled like Thomas leather and wood smoke, and something indefinably. Him that made her feel safe for the first time in years. She found him on the front porch, sitting in a rocking chair with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. The sight of him there, peaceful and solid and real, made her heart flutter with something she'd almost forgotten how to feel. Happiness. Good morning, she said softly, and he turned to her with a small smile that transformed his entire face. Morning. There's coffee on the stove, and I made some breakfast. Nothing fancy, just eggs and bacon. Catherine settled into the chair beside him, cradling her own cup of coffee. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of wet earth and growing things. In the distance, she could see cattle grazing peacefully in the pasture. It's beautiful here, she said. It's lonely, Thomas replied, but there was less bitterness in his voice than there had been the night before. It doesn't have to be. Thomas looked at her, and she saw hope warring with caution in his expression. Catherine, what happened last night? The things we said? I don't want to move too fast. We've both been hurt, and I need to know that. This is real, that it's not just desperation or grief talking. Catherine nodded, understanding. What do you need from me? Time, he said simply. Time to learn each other again. We're not the same people we were 7 years ago. No, we're not, Catherine agreed. We're older, sadder, more careful with our hearts, but the love is still there, Thomas. I can feel it. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher in the sky. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals with lazy grace. Tell me about her, Thomas said suddenly. About Emily. Catherine smiled, the first truly happy expression he'd seen from her. She was beautiful. Dark hair like yours, but curly like mine used to be. And so smart, Thomas. She could read by the time she was 4, and she loved stories about knights and dragons and brave adventures. What else? She had this laugh, Catherine continued, her voice soft with memory, like silver bells. And she was fearless always. Climbing trees or chasing after the chickens or trying to pet the neighbor's dog that everyone else was afraid of. She reminded me so much of you at that age. Thomas's throat tightened. I wish I could have known her. She would have loved you, Catherine said with certainty. She always asked about her papa, and I told her about you instead of Robert. I know that was wrong, but I couldn't bear to lie to her about something so important. It wasn't wrong, Thomas said firmly. If she was mine in your heart, then she was mine in truth. Catherine reached over and took his hand, and this time he didn't pull away. They sat like that as the morning stretched into afternoon, sharing stories and memories, slowly rebuilding the bridge that had been burned between them. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, carefully, Thomas and Catherine began to weave their lives back together. She helped him with the ranch work, her hands remembering skills she'd learned as a girl on her father's farm. He taught her to shoot properly, knowing that a woman alone on the frontier needed to be able to protect herself. They talked long into the evenings, sharing the stories of their lost years. Thomas told her about the war, about the friends he'd buried and the nightmares that still woke him sometimes. Catherine spoke of her marriage, of the loneliness and fear she'd lived with, of the daughter who had been her only joy. Trust came slowly, built on small gestures and quiet moments. Thomas leaving wildflowers on her bedside table, Catherine mending his torn shirts without being asked, the way he helped her down from her horse, his hands lingering just a moment longer than necessary, the way she sang while she worked, filling the house with music it hadn't heard in years. But even as their love rekindled like embers coaxed back to flame, such shadows from the past threatened their fragile happiness. It was on a Tuesday in late summer. When the riders came, Catherine was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard the thunder of hooves. Her blood turned to ice as she recognized the lead rider, Sheriff Martin Reeves from her hometown, a man who'd been Robert's friend and drinking companion. She ran to find Thomas in the barn, her heart pounding with fear. "Thomas, we have to run," she said breathlessly. "There are men coming, and I think they're here for me." Thomas looked up from the harness he was mending, his face immediately alert. "Maybe 5? The sheriff from Millbrook is with them?" Thomas stood slowly, his jaw hardening. "Then we don't run." "Thomas, you don't understand. They think I murdered Robert. If they take me back, they won't take you anywhere," Thomas said firmly, reaching for his rifle. "This is my land, and you're under my protection." The riders pulled up in front of the house just as Thomas and Catherine emerged from the barn. Sheriff Reeves dismounted, his hand resting on his gun but his eyes cold as winter stone. "Catherine Carmichael," he called out, "you're under arrest for the murder of your husband." "She's not going anywhere with you," Thomas said, stepping slightly in front of Catherine. Reeves smiled unpleasantly. "McKinnon, isn't it? I heard you'd been keeping company with murderers. That's a dangerous habit for a man to have. The only dangerous thing here is you coming onto my property, making threats," Thomas replied evenly, though Catherine could see the tension in his shoulders. "We have a warrant," one of the other men said, pulling a folded paper from his jacket. "What a warrant issued by who?" Thomas asked. "Judge Crawford. He's been in Robert Carmichael's pocket for years." "The law is the law," Reeves said. "Now step aside, McKinnon, before this gets ugly." Catherine felt the familiar cold grip of fear in her chest, but she forced herself to stand straight. She wouldn't cower anymore, not after finding her way back. "2, Thomas. I won't go back," she said clearly. "Not to face a jury of Robert's friends, not to hang for defending myself against a man who beat me bloody." "You murdered your husband," Reeves snarled. "You'll hang for it, one way or another." "No," Thomas said quietly, and something in his voice made all the men shift uneasily. "She won't." The silence stretched taut as wire. Catherine could hear her heart beating, could smell the dust kicked up by the horses, could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on all of them. Then Reeves made his mistake. He went for his gun. Thomas was faster. His rifle came up smooth and sure, the barrel centering on Reeves's chest before the sheriff's pistol cleared leather. "I wouldn't," Thomas said conversationally. "You see, gentlemen, I spent 4 years learning how to kill men who threatened what I cared about. I got very good at it." The other men looked uncertain, hands hovering near their weapons, but not quite willing to draw. "You can't fight the law, McKinnon," Reeves said, but his voice had lost some of its bluster. "I'm not fighting the law," Thomas replied. "I'm protecting an innocent woman from a corrupt sheriff and a kangaroo court. There's a difference." "She killed her husband. She defended herself against a drunk who was beating her," Thomas corrected. "And even if she had killed him in cold blood, she'd still be under my protection." This is my land, and she's my woman, and you'll take her over my dead body. Catherine's heart swelled at his words, at the absolute certainty in his voice. This was the man she'd fallen in love with all those years ago? Strong, protective, unwilling to back down when something important was at stake? "There are 5 of us, and 2 of you," one of the deputies pointed out. Thomas smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Catherine, how many shots can you make with that pistol I gave you?" "All 6, she said steadily, her hand moving to the gun at her hip. "And I've got 15 rounds in this rifle," Thomas said. "Mathematics isn't really in your favor, gentlemen." Reeves's face was red with anger and humiliation. "This isn't over, McKinnon. We'll be back with more men." "You do that," Thomas said, "and I'll be waiting." The sheriff and his men mounted up and rode away. But Catherine knew it was only a temporary reprieve. They would be back, and next time they'd bring an army. "Thomas," she said quietly after the dust had settled, "I can't let you fight my battles for me. If I run now, no." Thomas turned to her, his eyes blazing with determination. "We've run enough, Catherine. We've let other people control our lives for too long. I won't lose you again." "Come back with more men, then we'll face them together," Thomas said, taking her hands in his. "I love you, Catherine. I've loved you for 7 years, through war and heartbreak and loneliness. I'm not about to let a corrupt sheriff and a handful of cowards take you away from me now." Catherine felt tears sting her eyes. "I love you too. More than my own life." "Then marry me," Thomas said suddenly. "Right now. Today. If you're my wife, it gives us more legal standing. And more than that, ... double quotes, his voice softening. "I don't want to waste another day, Catherine. We've lost too much time already." Catherine stared at him, her heart racing. "What? Are you proposing? To me, in the middle of a crisis?" Thomas grinned, and for a moment, he looked like the young man she'd fallen in love with. "I'm proposing to you because I can't imagine spending another night without you as my wife." "Yes," Catherine whispered, and then louder, "Yes, Thomas McKinnon, I'll marry you." They were married that evening by Pastor Williams, who rode out from the nearby town of Cedar Ridge after Thomas sent word. The ceremony was simple, no white dress or fancy church, just 2 people who had found their way back to each. Others standing on the front porch of an old ranch house as the sun set behind the mountains. Catherine wore her best dress, the blue, one she'd packed when she fled Robert's house, and Thomas had cleaned up and put on his good shirt. Pastor Williams spoke the familiar words, but when it came time for their vows, Thomas and Catherine looked into each other's eyes and spoke from their hearts. "I promise to love you for all the days of my life," Thomas said, his voice steady and sure, "to protect you and cherish you and never let anyone take you from me again." "I promise to stay by your side through whatever comes," Catherine replied, tears streaming down her face. "To love you with all my heart and never doubt again that we belong together." They exchanged simple gold bands that Thomas had bought in town years ago, but never had anyone to give them to. When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed Catherine like a man greeting the sunrise after a long, dark night. "Well," the pastor said with a smile, "I've married a lot of couples in my time, but I don't think I've ever seen 2 people more determined to make it work." They spent their wedding night holding each other close, talking until dawn about their plans for the future. Thomas wanted to expand the ranch, maybe raise horses as well as cattle. Catherine dreamed of having a garden, of filling the house with laughter and love. "Do you think they'll come back?" Catherine asked as they watched the sun rise on their first day as husband and wife. "Probably," Thomas said honestly. "But it doesn't matter. We'll face whatever comes together." Catherine turned in his arms to look at him. "I'm not afraid anymore. For the first time in 7 years, I'm not afraid," Thomas said, kissing her forehead. "You never have to be afraid again." Sheriff Reeves did come back, but not in the way they expected. A week after the wedding, he arrived alone, dismounting slowly and keeping his hands visible. Thomas met him at the gate, rifle in hand, but not raised. "I'm not here to arrest anybody," Reeves said, without preamble. "Then why are you here?" Reeves looked older somehow, deflated. "Judge Crawford is dead. Heart attack 3 days ago. And Robert Carmichael's brother rode into town yesterday with some interesting information." Thomas waited, saying nothing. Seems Robert wrote him a letter before he died, Reeves continued. A drunken confession, you might say. Told him all about how he'd stolen another man's woman, how he'd helped old McKinnon cover up the letters, how he'd married a woman who never loved him. Catherine appeared beside Thomas, her hand finding his. The letter also mentioned how he'd been beating her, Reeves went on, his voice subdued. How he blamed her for the child's death, how he came at her with a belt the night he died. Thomas's voice was carefully neutral. And David Carmichael Robert's brother, he says it was self-defense. Says his brother got what he deserved. For laying hands on a woman, Reeves looked at Catherine directly for the first time. There won't be any more warrants, Mrs. McKinnon. Case is closed. Catherine sagged with relief, and Thomas's arm tightened around her. There's something else, Reeves said. The Carmichael place. Robert left it to his brother, but David doesn't want it. Says it holds too many bad memories. He's willing to sell it cheap, if you're interested. Thomas looked at Catherine questioningly. She said firmly, this is our home now. I never want to go back there. Reeves nodded and remounted his horse. For what it's worth, he said, I'm sorry for the trouble. I thought I was doing right by Robert's memory, but now you know the truth, Catherine said quietly. Yes, ma'am. Now I know the truth. After he rode away, Thomas and Catherine stood together in the yard, watching the dust settle. It's really over, Catherine said wonderingly. The past is over, Thomas agreed. Now we get to build our future. 5 years later, the McKinnon Ranch was the most prosperous spread in 3 counties. Thomas had expanded the herd and started raising horses just as he'd planned. Catherine's garden was the envy of every woman in the territory, bursting with vegetables and flowers that painted the landscape in brilliant colors. But the greatest joy in their life was the sound of children's laughter echoing through the house. Little James, now 3 years old, had his father's dark hair and his mother's blue eyes. 2-year-old Sarah was the image of her mother, but with Thomas's stubborn streak. And baby Emily, named for the daughter Catherine, had slept peacefully in her cradle. Surrounded by more love than any child could need, Catherine stood on the front porch, watching Thomas teach James to ride his pony while Sarah toddled around the yard, chasing chickens and squealing with delight. The scene was so perfect, so far from the nightmare her life had once been, that sometimes she wondered if she was dreaming. But then Thomas would look up and smile at her, or one of the children would run to her with skinned knees and tears, and she knew it was all beautifully, wonderfully real. That evening, after the children were asleep, Thomas and Catherine sat on their porch as they did every night, watching the stars come out over the Montana sky. Do you ever think about how different things might have been? Catherine asked, her head resting on Thomas's shoulder. You mean if my father hadn't lied? If we'd married when we were supposed to? Yes. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Sometimes, he admitted. But then I think about Emily, first Emily Ann, how you loved her, even though she came from heartbreak. And I think about how strong you had to become to survive what you survived. I think maybe we needed to be broken before we could be whole together. Catherine lifted her head to look at him. You really believe that? I believe that every scar we carry brought us to this moment, Thomas said, cupping her face in his hands. And I wouldn't trade this moment for anything in the world. Catherine kissed him then, soft and sweet and full of all the love they'd fought so hard to find again. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his. I love you, Thomas. McKinnon, she whispered. And I love you, Catherine McKinnon, he replied, until the day I die and beyond. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, witnessed 2 love stories played out across the centuries. But none of them, Catherine thought, could be more perfect than this 1-2 hearts that had found their way back to each other. Across years of sorrow and loss, finally safe in the knowledge that nothing would ever separate them again, the wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow and all the tomorrows to come. And in the warm circle of Thomas's arms, with their children sleeping safely inside, and their love burning bright as any star, Catherine McKinnon was finally completely home. In the distance, a coyote called out to the moon, its voice wild and free and full of longing. But Thomas and Catherine no longer knew longing. They had found what they were searching for in each other's arms. In the laughter of their children, in the simple miracle of love that endures all things, the frontier was vast and often cruel. But it was also a place where new beginnings were possible, where the past could be forgiven and the future could be written in hope instead of sorrow. For Thomas and Catherine McKinnon, that future stretched out before them like an endless prairie under an endless sky, beautiful, boundless, and blessed with the kind of love that comes only once in a lifetime, if at all. They were home. They were together. They were free.